What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Rollup for our series of Bitcoin and beyond. Today we have a special guest, David Seroy of Alpen Labs, to talk about some of the developments that they've been working on and pioneering in the Bitcoin scaling space. Rob, we're about 9 or 10 episodes deep into the weeds of technicals and some more higher level conversations. How are you feeling today?
Feeling smarter than I started this series. Or maybe, I don't know, actually. When I think about it, it's like I do still have a lot more questions than I have answers when I think about it. But we've gotten plenty of answers so far. There's been like a ton of really cool designs, innovative designs. And then we've also seen a lot of similar architectures when it comes to this with minor tweaks across different projects. And so, David, I'm pretty stoked to talk about Alpen. I think there's some other Bitcoin L2s out there that are doing some things with ZK, passing ZKproofs back to the Bitcoin L1. And so I'm pretty stoked to get into the design choices that you've made at Alpen, and then your general feelings on the landscape overall of how you're seeing Bitcoin evolve in the recent times.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you guys having me. I'm super excited. Alpen, we haven't really had much of a public facing presence just because we're kind of focused on a lot of the research and development side. But I've been keeping an eye on kind of some of the work you guys have been doing, and I think it's amazing. I think it's great diving into these topics, and I think that you guys have really done a good job of investigating them.
Yeah, appreciate that. And we've heard a lot of, like, through the rumor mill, Alpen has been one of the more highly regarded roll-up architectures, which I want to dive into more of the ZK work that you guys have done and some of the more technical design. But I think it'd be super helpful for our community to really have an understanding as to like how we even got here in the first place. Being some of the OGs, if you will, in this space on your end, I feel like you've seen this kind of evolve and now kind of like blow up after ordinals, and now it's like Bitcoin scaling, Bitcoin L2s, Bitcoin modularizing, if you will, is happening. And could we say that you predicted this, maybe? Or played a strong role in it? So perhaps if you want to kind of shed some light onto, how we got here and, how Alpen played a role in that.
Well, I definitely didn't have, a role in kind of predicting or bring this to fruition. I was mostly just doom scrolling and shit posting on Twitter, and I happened to get connected with a lot of people who are much smarter than myself. And, maybe that made me somewhat early, but, the flowers really go out to a lot of the other people. One of the earliest touch points was, Eric Wall, just like in 2019, when ZK Sync posted and said, hey, we can do this thing called the Rollup. He's like, what if this one day got brought to Bitcoin? Everybody ignored it. Like nothing related to Bitcoin ever came until I think it was about in like maybe 2022. There were two researchers that independently wrote papers about how you could build rollups on Bitcoin. One lesser known one is Tradeoffs wrote this article saying, hey, with covenants, here's how we can design some sort of rollup like mechanism. A little bit after that, a researcher named John Light, in collaboration with the Starkware Foundation and some of the stuff set up by Eric Wall and the Human Rights Foundation with Alex Gladstein, wrote like a pretty detailed research paper that said, here's how we could create ZK rollups on Bitcoin. And I think that was the initial piece that nerd sniped a lot of people. And then shortly after that, the Alpen team kind of busted on the scene, which there's 4 co-founders, all MIT grads, and they took a lot of that work and they created a detailed technical white paper, actually showing beyond the research, like how you could actually develop all of this out. And I would say those were the kind of foundational pieces that everybody else now has, in my opinion, kind of based a lot of their work on. That work, though, was mostly just theoretical because in all of the research papers, from Trey's to John's to Alpen's, you essentially needed 2 soft forks to bring ZK rollups. You need covenants, and more specifically like recursive covenants, and then a ZK verifier to receive the zero knowledge proof and verify it at the L1. So up until this point, it just nerd sniped some people, but it wasn't actually possible. Then people know the story usually that, about 9 months ago, Robin Linus bust onto the scene and said, hey, here's this thing called BitVM where we could, essentially compute anything on Bitcoin. So you perform this computation off chain and then you can arbitrate it on chain. And that gives us what's this called, this like one of n trust assumption, where as long as you have, say, 100 parties and one of them is honest, then the computation is valid. So you can run that computation to verify a zero knowledge proof. And that allows us to circumvent some of these prior requirements of having something like recursive covenants and a native zero knowledge proof verifier. And we kind of hack in this what we'll call not trustless, but trust minimized zero knowledge rollup structure. And that's what a lot of the teams, such as ourselves at Alpen and Citrea and some of these other teams are pursuing. It's not a perfectly trustless rollup. For that, we would need some sort of soft fork, but it should be kind of good enough. I can pause there, or I can kind of go into where the state of the BitVM stuff is.
Yeah. I mean, let's unpack that, and then we'll keep going. You mentioned how there was these two foundational papers you built on top of those, and took those more theoretical papers and put them into more practical implementational terms. And so I'm curious how you guys did that. But I also want to loop in like a couple of the things that we've been seeing as of like just in the zeitgeist as of recently, which was, you mentioned one of those foundational research pieces was from Starkware in collaboration with Eric Wall and some other people. And so they recently announced that they're going to deploy Starknet as on top of Bitcoin. And so I'm curious how Starknet and Alpen are similar and different, and then how you both sort of built on top of that foundational research piece put out by Starkware, but have maybe evolved into different directions. Could you just kind of like kind of like compare and contrast how you and Starknet are thinking about this in more recent terms, and how you formalized that theoretical piece?
Sure. So the key link between all of this is somehow the ability to verify a zero knowledge proof on the Bitcoin base layer. And if there's no soft forks, you have to go through BitVM. And then even within BitVM, there's tons of different implementations that we can talk about. There's like the BitVM 1, the BitVM 1.5, 2, 2.5. Like there's just a bunch of stuff going on there. That's the kind of like the default scenario, nothing else, like no soft forks are needed. What Ellie Bensasan and Starkware team are pursuing is if there can be a soft fork of OPcat for concatenate that comes in, then you could potentially hack in a Stark verifier. So a Stark, is a succinct, transparent, argument of knowledge. It's a type of zero knowledge proof that Starkware specializes in, that Ellie Bensasan was a kind of pioneer in. And if you had CAT, then you could potentially natively have a Stark verifier on the L1. And if you have a Stark verifier, then it makes it much easier for Starkware to create or take their pre-existing rollup structure, which is Starknet, and then bridge Bitcoin onto that and kind of merge it with some of their Ethereum ecosystem over there. And so what Starkware is doing is they're putting out a $1 million grant, which people will be able to collect if they can demonstrate research for the positive or even the negative benefits of OPcat. And I think that there is hope that if OPcat comes in, whether it's a standalone soft fork or maybe part of Rusty Russell's great script restoration or another sort of covenants proposal, then you can create the Stark verifier. You can start verifying Stark proofs, which allows you to bridge in, allows you to start using Starknet. Similarly, on Alpen side.
Before we get into Alpen side, just real quick, like basic question on that Stark side of things. Could you just elucidate like the difference of covenants and concatenation?
Well, covenants is a broad category where you can take a UTXO and you can essentially constrain how it could be spent. And that simple primitive allows you to do a lot of different things and add more expressivity and kind of programmability to Bitcoin. And so in Bitcoin circles for years now, we've been talking about having covenants, but there's a huge debate as to which type of covenant. Do you want a simple covenant? Do you want a generalized covenant? Do you want one that's kind of recursive? Is it dangerous? Is it not? It's kind of a complex scenario. I'd say the vast majority of the Bitcoin community says, hey, we want covenants, but they haven't yet agreed on which type and which one to activate. OPcat is a very, very simple primitive that allows you to concatenate two elements on the stack, which sounds very simple, but it has a ton of powerful implications. And so a lot of people see OPcat as the lowest common denominator in the covenant discussion. They say, okay, it's very simple and it's kind of clunky and like it's not going to make things very cheap on the L1. It's maybe not the best way to do it, but we feel pretty confident that it's reasonably safe. And we feel pretty confident that it's quite powerful. So again, it's that kind of like lowest common denominator for the covenants people. And then for the Starkware people, they want to use it so that you can verify a zero knowledge proof, specifically a ZKP called a Stark.
Awesome. Okay, that's great. And now, so that sounds perfect. Let's dive into what Alpen is doing with snarks.
Yeah. So right now, in order to verify some sort of zero knowledge proof, I had mentioned that without any sort of changes right now, you can use BitVM. So Rob and Linus released BitVM, which is a virtual machine. And in that VM structure, the main downside is that if you go through this what's called challenge response game, where this worst case scenario where the situation is contested and it's like we need to make sure that the proof is valid, it could take up to 6 months, which is like a substantially long time. So if somebody's trying to bridge out their funds, they can essentially freeze for 6 months before the situation is resolved. It can cause tons of issues. What Alpen did, and I will say, I think Citrea, their Clementine bridge, was like the first one to kind of maybe say, hey, we can build some sort of ZKP verifier within this BitVM. What our founding cryptographer, Liam Egan, did is he took some of the work that he's done, and we stripped out the virtual machine of BitVM, and we made it into a circuit, which means that you can't program all this arbitrary different things. We only wanted to do one thing and one thing only, which is verify a zero knowledge proof. So we stripped out the VM, which made it more efficient. And then he performed some other ZK magic that I probably can't really speak to. And we were able to shorten that 6-month window down to less than 1 month. As far as I know, that's the best implementation, or maybe it's not implemented yet, but that's the best kind of theoretical structure that you can get with like BitVM 1. So we can call that BitVM 1.5. What Robin and the ZeroSync team is working on is what they call BitVM 2, which can drop that down to 2 weeks, which is even better. The problem with BitVM 2 is that right now, as far as I know, it's not practical. It's too large to go on chain. It's too costly. They haven't yet fleshed out that details. So as far as I know, the best thing that you can get is what we created is this like BitVM 1.5, which we've called Snark NATO. And but then if Robin and those guys solve BitVM 2, then you could add some of the tricks that we did to get to the Snark NATO and make it maybe like a BitVM 2.5, which can reduce and make that even more efficient. That's probably as good as you can get without any sort of soft fork. The next step is a lot of the Starkware stuff that we talked about, where if we get OPcat, then it's like, do you even need BitVM, or can you just verify a Stark proof directly? If you want to go one step further beyond that, the community maybe eventually says, hey, we really love these zero knowledge proofs. Let's just natively get, a way to create a dedicated opcode that all it does is verify zero knowledge proofs. So you kind of go from this, like, I'm trying to map this out as like no soft forks, but probably least efficient, to maybe, hey, we need a soft fork. It's still a little bit inefficient, to Endgame, opcode with a ZKP verifier. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it seems like that also goes in from like least amount of social consensus effort all the way to like maximum amount. It's like figuring out where the balance is currently, or like it's almost like where is the Bitcoin community going to be willing to like budge, and like what will it take, what tech advancements or what like almost guarantees or soft guarantees will it take to not have a catastrophic effect on the network as the worst case, or even any sort of like detrimental effect as a whole. I'm curious, like in your circles, like where are you seeing like the budging happening, or like has there been over the last 6 months more of like this like open-mindedness happening, or is the social consensus still very much so like we should still build BitVM because this soft fork end goal or end result may not happen? Because if it does, then it almost seems like a lot of the BitVM work would be rendered somewhat not really worth the effort or the time to kind of continue on that path.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty good assessment. At Alpen Labs, like even before any of this BitVM stuff came out, it's like our baseline is like no changes will ever happen to Bitcoin, and like we will eventually position ourselves in the community to say, look, here's all the research, here's all the resources. If people want these types of soft forks, like we'll code it up, we'll build it out, we'll offer that community, but we're not necessarily going to push for it. Like our default is whatever the Bitcoin community has decided, we will work within those confines. But you made an interesting point, and this is something that I've been saying on Twitter, is that the the Overton window is shifting a bit, and like the power is kind of shifting, where I think that the builders are becoming a bit more in power than they used to. It's like in what I'll call the old world Bitcoin, the default is like you really couldn't build anything, or like you could, but like very, very, very clunky. And so even if people wanted to build things, they just couldn't. And it was kind of the ossifiers, or I guess like the just like the non-technical, maximalists were kind of in charge. Now, even if we don't get any sort of soft forks, people are going to build, and they're building like some pretty cool and pretty complex things. And maybe those things aren't done in the most efficient manner possible. Maybe they take up lots of block space, or they're going to like increase block fees. But the bottom line is they're going to be able to get built. And so this shifts more of the power to the builder community, where people say, look, I don't need to argue here on Twitter anymore. I'm not necessarily going to like, spend all this time advocating, please, please, please get in my soft fork. Like, we're just going to build our solution and test it in the market because it exists within the current confines of Bitcoin. And I think that's like a very cool and very powerful thing. And that may help progress this conversation forward, where people say, hey, a lot of the stuff is already going to get built. Let's just do it in a proper, clean manner. And let's push forward that conversation on covenants. And so I do think, to answer your question, that has pushed forward people's interest, where they say, look, like maybe we do want to activate OPcat. And if we do want to activate OPcat, maybe we want to activate, other covenant proposals. A lot of this is kind of above my pay grade, and I don't feel comfortable like specifically advocating for it. But I will say that in some of the conversations I've had at conferences and with people in the know, it does feel like that conversation is progressing a lot. Where the taboo topic comes up is like activation. It almost feels like there's a consensus where people say, yes, like we want covenants, or like cat is good to go. Even a lot of the biggest kind of dissidents of cat are kind of turning and saying they're okay with it. But if somebody mentions like activation, like how do you actually activate it? Do you go through the miners? Do you do a speedy trial? Like what about a user resisted soft fork? Like that's a very topic that not many people have wanted to broach because it can get very contentious.
Yeah, that's kind of like what I'm coming to. Like, it's just like, it feels like an uphill battle almost. Like why not just go build on Ethereum? And I'll kind of pose this question, like why do we even need this? Like what is the ecosystem that we're aiming to kind of build on top of Bitcoin? I guess outside of just let's build more transaction fees, or let's build more tech to get more block space demand, so the transaction fee model of Bitcoin is stronger long term. But why build this here and now versus just going and building on like a smart contract platform that's that has smart contracts?
Oh man, I have so many hot takes on this. I think what we're seeing in the Ethereum ecosystem is a lot of the research is getting like actually very advanced and kind of like fleshed out. There are still some blanks and some spaces to kind of fill in, but a lot of them are saying, hey, like we will have the high throughput, we will have the high bandwidth, like we will have the expressivity, like we will solve all of these, cross composability and interoperability issues. But it's like, where are the apps? And there's a little bit of a crisis going on there, where people are saying like, all right, like what's the next world computer or all this stuff that we're going to use for? And from my perspective, the app has always been money. Like money has and always will be like the primary app. And for all of, I think some of Bitcoin's shortfalls and faults, what it has remained steadfast on is this idea of money. Like the Bitcoiners to their core have understood that is the core revolution. Like that is this unstoppable force that is coming for us. And I think that is why, despite Bitcoin just being this digital rock, it does nothing, why it has still maintained itself as the kind of like the black hole that everybody wants to be a part of, that has maintained like the highest market cap, because there's always been holding out this hope that even if none of this other stuff came to Bitcoin, that single use case is good enough. But if we can combine it with this world of like ZK and expressivity and scalability, that is the true endgame. Not only just for money, but this idea of taking like any sort of arbitrary computation, any way to express yourself, and you can compress that into a simple cryptographic proof, and you can post that to the Bitcoin base layer, which is this kind of like digital anchor of truth. You could take any sort of expression. There's kind of a beautiful philosophical element there is like you are allowing people to speak any language and express themselves in any way that they can possibly think. And then you can anchor that to this like ledger of truth, all surrounded by money. Like that is such a powerful concept. And I think what a lot of the Ethereum community has done, they've really created this kind of modular setup where they say, look, we're going to scale the expressivity and the computation off chain. We're going to have like the DA off chain, but like we have to maintain the base layer as small as we possibly can. You're only going to post zero knowledge proofs there. Everything else is going to be abstracted off chain. I don't even know if they meant to, but they really built like the perfect scaling solution for Bitcoin, in my opinion.
Yeah. If we operate on the premise that money is anything valuable, then it's so general. Anything that we're going to define as valuable, we can use it as money and put it on a blockchain, and then it all becomes composable and interoperable with one another. And so all of a sudden we get this Bitcoin is money, and maybe it's the most widely, whether it's the best store of value or it's the best cash, people can use it for whatever they want to use it for. And then we can also combine it with all of the other things that people find valuable. And this is the power of blockchain, because it's no longer just this siloed environment for operating in a single vertical of money, but it's this expressivity of anything valuable and using anything valuable in this like wide array economy. And so that is really, really powerful to build money, because what I'm hearing you say is that it's not just Bitcoin that is a money application. Money is the application of blockchain. And so Bitcoin is one form of money that lives on a blockchain, but there's so many more forms of money that can live on blockchains and all coexist with the other forms of money on chain.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, I mean, Bitcoin, both the network will be the anchor to post all these zero knowledge proofs on, and Bitcoin, the asset, will be the collateral, which all of these other assets are based on. Everything will essentially be a derivative of either the Bitcoin network or Bitcoin, the asset. Sure, if as a byproduct we get all this other stuff, you know, stable coins, real world assets, whatever, that's cool. But for me personally, the revolution hasn't always been about you know, Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think
sounds
that's
like a
powerful.
Bitcoin maxi. You sound like a Bitcoin maxi, man.
Like I'm a Bitcoin maxi, or I'm hated by everyone, you know, because it's like I go and talk to some of my ZK and like crypto friends, and they're like, oh, you know, Bitcoin boomer or whatever, you know, Bitcoin digital rock. And then I talk to some of my Bitcoin maxi friends, and they're like, you know, like what's this, you know, Ethereum stuff you talk about? But now I feel like this, I guess I'll call it like a middle ground. Like it's gaining huge groundswell, and I will say behind the scenes, I mentioned this early, you know, Alpen's not really a super public facing company, but a lot of the conversations that were happening in private, I've never been more excited or more optimistic for what's happening. I think that we are seeing a reversal of the brain drain, not just of like financial capital and VCs looking for some new thing to like, you know, pump, but true like hardcore intellectual researchers and developers and like ecosystems that are saying, hey, this is really freaking interesting, and we potentially see this as the end game. I don't know. I feel like I'm riding high over the past 6 months with Alpen.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I mean, the whole thing has just been like fully constructed over the last. I mean, it feels like it's been fully constructed, but as you said, it's been 6 months of like excitement and attention, but it's been years in the making. And kind of coming back to that point and to your larger thesis with regards to the structure of Bitcoin scaling. We've heard quite a bit about like this leapfrog effect where a lot of Bitcoin scaling can basically emulate what Ethereum has done, but then just kind of skip right to the end game, which I think that you kind of have this thesis on with Alpen about, and we've talked a lot about it being ZKproofs. But like on the road to the end game, what we're seeing on this series that we're doing is all these solutions are like they're extremely centralized, and they're extremely risky from a tech perspective compared to other rollup designs or the Bitcoin L1 as itself. Like, how do you feel about this ironic character of Bitcoin is this hard money, it's basically unfuckwithable, but then like these solutions that are being built to scale it are early, but they're almost like the opposite, where they're extremely fuckwithable.
Yeah, I think that's like, if I'm understanding what you're saying, is that, you know, to put it in a basic analogy, it's like with Bitcoin, we want small boxes. Like we want small, like computers, small hardware. Everybody can run a node. That's what keeps it decentralized. But like somewhere along the stack to scale, it's like you need a big box. You know, this fundamentally goes to this idea of like why they wanted to raise the block size during the block size wars. and why it was so contentious, because it's kind of like at odds with decentralization. And maybe what you're implying here is with rollups, you have maybe a hyper-centralized sequencer, or you have these provers that need to be run on these big giant computers. And it's kind of like, whoa, like you're preaching this decentralized small box vision with Bitcoin, yet how you're proposing to scale it is with these kind of like big box centralized solutions. And I will say, one of the beauty of a rollup and these ZK solutions is that you can still maintain some form of you can inherit the little box philosophy of Bitcoin within your kind of big box. So even if we have a hyper centralized sequencer and we have a very centralized prover, if both of those entities go rogue or they want to deceive, you can always circumvent them. You can go around them. You don't have to go through the big box sequencer. You can submit directly to the Bitcoin L1, or you can create the zero knowledge proof yourself. So it's kind of like in good and happy times, we're willing to use the big boxes, the centralized sequencers and the provers. But if they ever go rogue, we know that we always have some sort of escape valve. And even with that in mind, I will say that there is some very bleeding edge research where maybe we can decentralize the sequencer. Maybe we can, have client side proving or real time proving to where you can create the zero knowledge proofs directly from your phone as opposed to sending it to a big, AWS warehouse. And so some of that admittedly is still TBD. It's under active research, but there's reasons to believe that we're progressing towards that vision. For us at Alpen, even if we never get the decentralized sequencer, even if we never get these kind of client side proving schemes and this efficient ZKP proving, I still think it's good enough. I still think that even if you have a single centralized sequencer, that sequencer can't steal your funds. It can't rug you. This allows us to build towards those solutions that I still think is good enough, with the hope and expectation that we can have the full grand vision of where everything kind of becomes the little box philosophy in the future. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've drawn a lot of comparisons to rollups on the Ethereum landscape, but we've been promised fraud proofs for some time, and that still hasn't happened. So I think it's just continuously a progressive decentralization, a gradual kind of shift towards the end game of what scaling a base layer is, and I think there's still very much up for grabs. I think it's a good time to kind of dive into that. I mean, you guys are clearly technically sound in this scaling of ZKproofs of Bitcoin. So maybe we can dive into kind of why you've built Alpen the way that it is built now, and perhaps even start with the broader structure as a whole, and then we can kind of dive into some of the technical details and intricacies, and see if we can find any kinks in the armor here.
Why we chose our kind of implementation or details. I mean, I think that this is what we're doing is the closest thing you can get to the most trust minimized or trustless solution without any sort of software. Just to make it an easy example, a lot of chains are just essentially functioning on multi-sigs. That's obviously not very trustless. What we want is using the BitVM structure, using the best version of BitVM, where you can kind of post data onto the Bitcoin L1. You can create the zero knowledge proofs. You can unilaterally exit. That gives the best and the highest assurances to Bitcoiners. I will say, maybe something like Lightning, arguably has higher, better trust, which is valid. But I think that we've seen limitations with Lightning, that it really only does payments. It probably doesn't scale very well with number of users. So I should say, we wanted the most trust minimized solution within the context of adding, an expressivity layer to Bitcoin, which I don't think Lightning can do. I think Lightning is amazing. I hope it does exceedingly well, but there's just a ton of use cases that it really cannot go after.
So you mentioned quite a bit about Lightning Network as well, being kind of an option or kind of something that the Bitcoin ecosystem has tried, as well as your technical designs and kind of the philosophy that you guys are embracing. Let's talk a bit more about some of the similarities and differences between Alpen and some of the other kind of ZK rollups, if you will, in the Bitcoin scaling space. I know that you guys are doing some different things with the way your blocks are confirmed, pre-confirmations, as well as some other aspects. So maybe you can kind of talk us through some of the technical design choices there and kind of why those are how they are.
Sure. Well, so the most obvious, technical design trade-off is kind of whether you want to go multi-sig or closer to this like trust minimized or trustless solution. We're obviously going to be as close as we can to having everything verified by BitVM, or what we call Snarknado, which allows you the best sort of trust assumptions. I think a lot of other teams or projects just be very skeptical and assume the default, is everybody's guilty until proven innocent with working code. And by that, I mean everybody's probably on a multi-sig until they prove otherwise. But we're definitely kind of building in that direction of more of the trust minimized. Within the actual rollup itself, one thing that we're doing that may be unique is we'll have pre-confirmations. So essentially when you kind of like submit some sort of transaction, in Bitcoin, it takes 10 minutes to confirm. In Ethereum, it takes 12 seconds to confirm. In rollups, you could have what's called a pre-confirmation, where you can get a transaction receipt sent back to you that says, look, I am promising you that this will be submitted into a valid block. And that gives you the comfort to kind of update your UI or progress your application. And so Alpen could do that in 250 milliseconds, which is very, very fast and instantaneous. The initial version of it will be kind of a trusted version where you're trusting that we will in fact submit that to the block. In the future, you could probably set up some mechanism to where you have a stake, and if Alpen says to someone that we will submit into the block and it doesn't, then they would be slashed and kind of reimbursed and compensated for that. That's one of the major different design choices that we're making. And then another popular one that people talk about is off-chain DA. So I do expect Bitcoin fees on L1 to go up very, very, very high. And that will impact everything, including, rollups. But rollups, when they post their DA off-chain, it's called a validium or a volition. That allows us to scale, in theory, infinitely, but you're taking on some additional trust assumptions. You're trusting wherever that data is posted. So we'll have optionality for users to, on a per transaction basis, be able to post on this off-chain DA. So if you say, hey, this is a very high value transaction, I want this on Bitcoin, great, you're paying a little bit more for that. If you say, hey, like I'm fine maybe posting my data on Ethereum, like this is not as high value of a transaction, then you could take on that DA. So having alternative DAs that you can post to is very, very interesting. I think those are the major design trade-offs. I've already spoken at length about Snarknado.
Do you want to say a few words about the applications and ecosystem that you have in the works on Alpen? I think this is going to be particularly of interest as to why someone is going to bridge, or I guess maybe about the bridge too, which you mentioned briefly, but also about the applications that are on that on the other side of that bridge over on Alpen.
Okay, I do want to mention the bridge because this is really important and probably a differentiator. We've talked a lot about how bridging from the BTC to asset to the L1 to the L2, it goes over this bridge, and people think that that's kind of BitVM. BitVM, or our version of BitVM, which we're calling Snarknado, that is one component. That's just the way to verify the zero knowledge proof in this challenge response game. On top of that, you have the actual bridge implementation and design. So these are two different things that teams can kind of vary on, is how they want to implement BitVM and then how they want to implement the bridge. So we, I think, created Snarknado, which allows that like 1 month, which is the best on BitVM. And then a little bit of an alpha leak here, like we'll also be releasing, a revised bridge spec within the next like week or two. And one of the complaints about a lot of these bridges, which Seroy got from the Taproot Wizard guys, is this liquidity issue where if somebody requests, say, $10 billion from the L2 back out onto the L1, the operator or the bridge operator essentially has to front that money. They can't just take $10 billion out of the bridge and then swap it over. They have to pay $10 billion out of pocket first and then get reimbursed. And if they don't, then they get slashed and the bridge starts to break. So it's been this huge critique as to how do you solve this liquidity issue. And I will say that I think that we have a design which massively mitigates and arguably solves that issue. I think I probably don't want to go into details on that. I'm not sure what I'm allowed to share or not. Probably not a big deal, but that paper will probably be coming out in the next like couple of weeks or so. And I think that will be a good design that a lot of teams will look at and want to implement. Awesome. On the app side, I think we're going to try to keep the ecosystem, relatively curated. I think that we are prioritizing like Bitcoin as money and financial applications. If a lot of the kind of like apes and degeneracy and NFTs and ordinals, all that stuff comes on, like inevitably it will, that's fine. It is what it is. But like our priority as a team is saying, look, we believe in Bitcoin as like sound money. We believe in these ideas of like, a Bitcoin-based financial ecosystem. So things like being able to borrow against your Bitcoin-backed stablecoins. Maybe eventually you want Bitcoin-backed stablecoins that earn significant amounts of yield, kind of like an Athena-style product. Within that, maybe you want perpetuals. You want people to be able to trade Bitcoin. You could have a perpetuals product where if somebody wanted to trade Tesla stock, but they only had Bitcoin as collateral, you could use the Bitcoin as collateral, or you could use Bitcoin-backed stablecoins as collateral, and you can trade, Tesla or Apple shares. Like that's potentially a very cool product. I also like this idea of something like hash rate futures or block space futures. I think that was a very compelling product. There are a few other things that I think we're cooking internally that may be unique, but really it's just kind of like adding these vanilla DeFi applications with the highest level of security possible.
Yeah. I'm so stoked to see Bitcoin DeFi leapfrog Ethereum DeFi and build out a lot of the financial applications that have found product market fit. I think DeFi is one of the few things on Ethereum that has found product market fit, and now seeing Bitcoin kind of like bring that to life in a reimagined form, I think is super exciting. And very curated too, because it doesn't make sense, right? Like if you're trading meme coins and apes, stay on Ethereum and Solana. Like Bitcoin is like going to be the home of money, and I think it makes sense to keep those two types of ecosystems separate and then combine them when it makes sense for that niche type of user. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Quick question on the bridge. All right, Andy, if you have a question on the
There's just no way you're going to keep the apes out. Like the speculation, if money's the number one use case, speculation is the number two. Like, I mean, good luck, David.
Yeah, no, and don't get me wrong. Like, I know the deal. I know what moves markets. Like, I know how these people operate. It's especially funny when you go out to like Asia and you talk to them and they're like, what are you talking about? Like, they're like, we've had Bitcoin L2s for like 3 years now. And yeah.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. Like the Western world, if you will, has especially like in Ethereum, there's like this big argument about like centralized sequencers and like where's the off-chain DA being posted, and then in like some of these Eastern world Bitcoin L2s are like, yeah, no, it's an L2, it's a roll up.
They truly don't care, and like there's not even a hiding of it where they like put up this guise. They're just like, no, like we're here to degen. Like what else is there? It's like, I don't know, changing the world with money.
Yeah. So my question on the bridge side, which is just a little bit separate from the degeneracy meme coins that might happen on the other side of the world, is like this bridge is something that we've sort of seen in the Ethereum landscape, where it's like there's this general message passing layer underneath, and then there's like a bridge passing asset transfer layer on top. And so this underneath layer, call it Sharknado, is more of like these messages that we're passing are the ZKproofs, right? And so we're kind of like generating the proof on the L2 where it's cheap and quick to do so, and then we're passing that message back to the L1 to verify.
A little bit. Like there is, it doesn't quite have the same mechanism. Like if you're familiar with this idea of a pre-signed Bitcoin transaction, it's essentially you're almost like creating a template and you're like filling in everything, and I'm handing it off to you guys, and I'm saying, look, I've filled in all of my parts of this transaction. If and when you want to submit this in the future, you just add your signature and you submit it to the Bitcoin chain. It's essentially pre-signed by me. It's ready to go. All of these bridge designs, it's a ton of pre-signed Bitcoin transactions. And the reason you do that is you essentially map out, you say, what is every possible scenario that can happen? Like, who can steal? Who can come to the rescue? If that person steals, can this person come to the rescue? Like, if we submit this ZK proof, like, that's how all these bridge designs work. That's also why they're very, very clunky. So I don't know if there's as much of this like message passing mechanism or anything like that, as opposed to us just straight up defining every possible scenario that can happen. This is also why something like covenants is so hyper valuable, where if you remember what I said, you can restrict the output of a UTXO. So if you can restrict it and say, hey, it can only happen with these 1 or 2 use cases, then we don't need to make pre-signed transactions for 100,000 or 1 million different use cases. It's like the covenant says you can only do this type of thing. So that's pulling back a little bit of the technical curtain.
Yeah. So how does the soft fork change the implementation that you guys have now? Like we spoke about leapfrogging, right? If OPcat gets approved, would you guys leapfrog to like a different design that is more like verifying on the L1 without BitVM? if covenants get approved, would you guys leapfrog to a different design? How do some of those BIPs change your implementation?
Yeah. Okay. So right now with like the BitVM setup, you have to think about it like say somebody transfers over 10 Bitcoin, that's like one UTXO. It goes on the stack, and you're creating a ton of pre-signed transactions to say if somebody wants to bridge back that exact same 10 BTC UTXO, they have to go through this whole BitVM process with all these pre-signed transactions. If somebody wants to bridge over another one Bitcoin, same thing. You have to pre-sign all these transactions. So like in the current bridge design, you almost think of it's like stacking like receipts of like UTXOs, and to bridge them in and out, you can only bridge out those whole entire UTXOs, and each one of those is bound by a set of like pre-signed transactions and setup. So every time somebody bridges over, there has to be a massive setup process. And because you have to expect, like if somebody wants to withdraw, like what are all the different scenarios that can essentially happen? And so it's a very kind of clunky, it's very inefficient. You need snark NATA, you need pre-signed transactions, you need the bridge implementation, all this stuff. If you had some sort of like ZKP verifier or covenants, like we talked about, you can almost create like what's called like a UTXO pool, where you could just have like one UTXO address where many people can essentially pool funds in there. So instead of it being like, you know, 1 Bitcoin, 10 Bitcoin, like a stack, it's almost just like, here's like 1,000 Bitcoin in here. And if you want to move these 1,000 Bitcoin and you want to send them to somebody else back onto the L1, you need to receive a zero knowledge proof. So if we had covenants and a native ZKP verifier, whether it's like with Cat, kind of like what Starkware wants to do, or this like dedicated op ZKP verifier that we've talked about, you create this kind of covenant or this coin pool, and you restrict that UTXO. Again, I'll say that a covenant allows you to restrict how funds are spent, and you say you can only spend these transactions if you submit a valid zero knowledge proof for that. And so in order to move funds out of the pool, you receive a zero knowledge proof. So slightly different types of setups there. The latter one is obviously much cleaner, much cheaper, much easier to reason about, I think.
But that requires covenants, and covenants require a soft fork.
Yeah. I mean, best case scenario, we get a soft fork of a ZKP verifier, and we get like a dedicated covenants. I will say the Alpen Labs team, a lot of people don't know this, but they actually put forward a ZK rollup proposal where you could do that setup that I had just mentioned to you without covenants. So I would say the lowest common denominator is like a pure ZKP verifier. If you have the ZKP verifier, everything else becomes possible. Getting covenants is just a nice bonus on top of that.
Awesome.
Do you have any crazy predictions for the Bitcoin scaling space in 2024, 2025?
I think within the next year, I think we'll see an average of sats per vbyte over 500 sats per vbyte. For context, I think it's at like 10 right now. So maybe like a 50x growth in fees. And I think that will make a lot of people angry.
Off.
And
make the miners very, very happy.
Well, yeah, I mean, like quick tangent, we talked to some of these miners, like I haven't, but just, you meet some of the conferences and stuff. It's like, yeah, we're building rollups or whatever. And they're kind of like, they're just so oblivious, like to a lot of the stuff that happens in Bitcoin. They're just ruthless, like mercenary capitalists. And it's like, yeah, no, like I think like they say, well, what do you think sats per vbyte is going to be? And you just see their eyes like light up. They're like, oh my God, the amount of money that I think some of these rollups and a lot of these L2s, whether they're real or not, are going to bring to miners is going to be absolutely insane.
It is nuts. David, we got to bounce. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate your insights here, and look forward to Alpen, and would love to have another conversation soon. See if your prediction comes true.
Yeah, thanks guys. I appreciate you having me.